Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We've still got a few minutes before we start, so hopefully more people will join us in the next few minutes. But yeah, a very warm welcome. And if you've connected and are happy to tell us a little bit about yourselves, maybe tell us where you're joining us from and perhaps what your role in your school is. I'm in a very, very wet south of England at the moment. Yeah, if you can tell us in the chat where you're joining us from. Um, My colleague Rachel is here as our tech support today. So if you've got any tech issues now or later on, please let Rachel know and she will be able to help you with those. Well, lovely. So we've got several continents represented. I see Cambodia, Marrakesh, the UK, Thailand, Poland, Barcelona. So yeah, a very warm welcome to everyone. Okay, we've got a couple more minutes, and hopefully more people will join us in that time. Yeah, it's good to have a nice range of countries represented. Yeah, quite a few people from Thailand today. A late one for you, I assume. Um, hey, yeah, a couple of participants from Italy. Um, yeah, I think Thailand and Poland are winning at the moment in terms of the numbers in the room. Right, and we've got one more minute and then we'll get started. Hopefully a few more people will join us before then. Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, if you weren't here yet, Rachel, my colleague, is our tech support today. So if you need any help now or later, if you've got any technical issues, just let her know and she'll do her best to help you. Okay, well, and it's time to start. So welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Shaka and I'll be the webinar e-moderator today. As I said, Rachel is our tech support. So if you've got any tech problems, let her know and she will be able to help you. Before we start, just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded. So please be aware we are recording the webinar so that we can share the recording with you and anyone who signed up over the next day or two. Well, let me welcome today's speaker, Tom Beakes, who's a trainer at the Bell Foundation. I think many of you will be familiar with Tom, but for those who are not, Tom has worked in English language education since 2003. He's taught around the world and is particularly interested in international education and teacher development. You may know that Tom helped create our Language for Results International suite of online training courses, and he's also one of our assessors for the Bell Foundation's ALFRE accreditation program. And in today's webinar, Tom will be looking at how we can make the most of students' emergent language in lessons. Feel free to use the chat during the session if you have any questions for Tom. I will collect them during the webinar and then post them to Tom at the end. And in the next couple of days, you will receive an email from us with a recording of the webinar, but also any useful links or resources that Tom will be mentioning today. So without further ado, over to Tom.
Thank you, Shaka, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Well, Shaka's already just given us a brief overview of what we're doing, so I'm going to skip on straight to our learning intentions for today. So we're going to be defining what we mean by emergent language, and talking about why it might be useful for promoting academic language development with our students. And we're going to think about how we can create a good environment to maximize opportunities for the production of emergent language, including thinking about when to and how to make decisions on dealing with those opportunities. We'll be looking at specific techniques as well for dealing with emergent language, and we'll think about what that might look like in different contexts. So we will be looking at examples from primary and secondary, and indeed early years as well, because I know many people work across different stages. And I think that many of the ideas and techniques that we're going to talk about won't be new to most of you, but I do hope that you'll be able to take away perhaps some ideas in terms of having greater clarity about why we do the things we do in the classroom, and how quite small changes that we make to our practice can really improve the language development of our learners. I think Shaka may have mentioned it, but if you do have any questions as we go through the slides as well, please feel free to add those to our Q&A panel or the chat. So here's our outline for the session, and we're going to start by looking at what is emergent language and why it might be useful. And I think it's worth just pointing out that this is a concept that really emerges from the field of English language teaching, English as a foreign language. So if you're from that background, you might be quite familiar with that. If you're not, then I'm sure you'll be familiar with a lot of the ideas we're going to talk about, but you may not have heard them labeled in this way. And emergent language is the unplanned language that is needed or produced by our learners during classroom interactions. And we can think of it as a seedling that's growing out of the ground. Okay, so emergent language is our seedling. It has emerged, and we can pull it out and throw it away to maintain the orderliness of our lesson, or we can ignore it and it'll probably wither away, or we can tend to it and allow it to flourish and see what it turns into. So as an example of emergent language, imagine you're teaching a biology lesson on conditions for plant growth, and the class are discussing their experiments, and they're talking about the different plants and their plant pots, measuring them and so on. And the teacher hears a student say something like this. And of course, this is an example of emergent language. Okay, it's emerged spontaneously because of the activity that's taking place, and the teacher then can choose a range of options. You could ignore it completely. You could interrupt to correct the student, because we can notice there are some inaccuracies in the sentence. They could choose to maybe write down the sentence and return to it later on the board and talk about it then, and elicit suggestions for how it could be improved. They could lean into the conversation that the child is having and say something like, "Is more higher?" and elicit a self-correction. They could write the words tall and high on the whiteboard and ask the students which word they think is better to describe a plant or a tree. They could write a gapped sentence on the board with the last part of that sentence, because gap the light, because there's a missing word there, and then they might be able to elicit from the other learners what that missing word could be. And then perhaps they could even elicit other phrases that could be used to express the same meaning as because of. as well. So these are all examples of dealing with emergent language in the moment, and we're going to explore these techniques in more depth later. And I'm sure you can already see how some of these options might be more productive than others in terms of language development. And so we're really going to be looking and exploring at how we kind of make good choices when it comes to deciding what to do. So why is it important to focus on emergent language in the classroom, and especially in multilingual classrooms? And I think there is a range of reasons. And the first one is it's really helping the learners at the point of need, at the point of use. And this is likely to aid language acquisition much more effectively than just introducing decontextualized language out of context, in a separate lesson, for example. Which is why we often advocate for, integrating our multilingual learners into mainstream settings as early and as quickly as we can. It's also inherently adaptive. So we're meeting the developmental needs of different learners. We're meeting the learners where they are rather than insisting they're following a particular sequence or stage of learning. So in this way, we could also think of it as a form of scaffolding. We're building on what's already there. And if you've studied the theory of learning, right, we know that it's social and dialogic. And you may also be familiar with Vygotsky's idea that learning happens in this zone of proximal development, the area that's just outside our comfort zone. That next step in our development. And emergent language is at a really amazing ladder into that zone of proximal development, I think. And also from a social perspective, it often involves like co-construction of meaning and that dialogue between learners and teacher, which we'll explore more of later. It's great for raising awareness. It promotes noticing both of new language, and it also helps learners notice the gap of where their language is now and where they need it to be to express what they want to express. And it's context situated. So it's related to what I was saying before, but it is learning language in the context of the classroom and whatever subject or topic is being learned. And of course, I probably don't need to explain this to many of you if you're here in this webinar, but when it comes to learning language, we don't teach it by explaining the rules, just in the same way that we don't teach children to play sport by sitting them down and explaining rules to them. We let them play it and watch it in order to learn. And of course, learning language is no different. And this is obviously much more relevant in an English medium international school context where most of the children are learning English and learning through English at the same time. And of course, this approach also mimics really how we learn incidental language out in the real world, right? We find ourselves in new situations and are exposed to new types of language, or we find ourselves in situations where we need language that we don't quite have. And this is a really powerful environment for learning. We can also think of working with emergent language as a more responsive approach, and I think it fits with the idea that language is dynamic and messy rather than kind of fixed and entirely rule-based and right or wrong. And so I think in this way it fits really well into the idea that I think is becoming more and more common in international school classrooms of ideas like translanguaging, where pupils are encouraged to use all their linguistic resources for learning. And we're not just thinking of it in terms of bounded languages, English or not English. So again, this responsive nature fits well into this context. And lastly, and connected very much to the things I've just mentioned, by providing this language in context, it provides greater agency and engagement to the students. It's giving them the language they need. It allows them to more accurately express what they want, and that's really powerful. And if you ever had that experience of when you're learning a new language and you recently learn a new phrase or a structure, and then when you're out the next day, you suddenly see that word, or you hear it spoken, or you're able to use it in an interaction with someone, and that's like such an amazing feeling. Like, oh yes, I just was able to use that thing that I just learned. And I think that's really, it's a magical experience, and it's really motivating. And so that's very powerful, and giving our students that experience uh, uh, and that routine of working with language in every context is really enhancing other skills as well, like their creativity, their decision making, because we're encouraging rather than closing down experimentation. Okay, so this all sounds a bit woolly and theoretical. It is going to get more concrete. And the thing about emergent language is that, of course, it has to emerge from somewhere. So I do want to look briefly at what classroom conditions are required that are going to encourage this language. And I'm going to use a food metaphor. It's coming up to lunchtime. I probably shouldn't have done this, and now I'm feeling really hungry. But anyway, to illustrate how we can create these conditions for working effectively, then I'm going to use the metaphor of the classroom as a kitchen, and a lesson plan as a recipe. So rigidly following the lesson plan or the course book, it's a bit like following a meal kit recipe that you can see here. And, I love a meal kit recipe. It's nice and simple. It's really easy at the end of the day when I'm tired. But the end result is usually fine. But, the process is very structured and mechanical. It doesn't require a lot of skill. And we can only use the very limited ingredients that we get provided with. Whereas we can compare it to perhaps eating a delicious or home-cooked or professionally cooked meal. And I think that's what working with emergent language is. It's like a chef making a delicious meal. They're tasting and checking the food as they go. They're adding ingredients, adjusting the heat or the temperature. And yes, there's an element of improvisation, but actually, the end result is very clear throughout, and the resulting meal is tailored to optimize all those flavors and textures and maximize enjoyment. But of course, in order to be able to do that, they have to access a wide range of ingredients, and they need to know how to use different cooking techniques. So in our analogy then, creating the conditions for working with emergent language requires two elements, and that's a well-stocked kitchen or a well-stocked set of tasks. So these are our task types that promote emergent language use. And we also need a set of skills to enhance and enrich those ingredients and turn them into something delicious and satisfying. And so those are the skills and techniques that we need as educators to react to the emergent language in a way that's going to enhance and enrich the language development of the students. So I think it's useful then to have a look at the types of ingredients that our kitchen staples. Okay, so these are the sort of task types that are good for generating emergent language. I'm not going to go into a lot of depth because many of these will be familiar to you all, but there are things like the kind of lead-ins that we do with our brainstorming activities, our prediction tasks, our responses to texts. This is often described as directed. Was it directed? I can't remember now. Directed activities responding to text or something. Dart. We have a great idea on it on our webpage, which you can look at. Basically, any task that isn't just read the text and answer a boring list of questions about it. Anything that goes into a bit more depth. If you're a language teacher, you might want to use some grammaticization texts if you're comfortable with grammar. These are ideas like dictogloss or using gap fills to represent particular grammatical structures, like maybe verb conjugations or things like that. We might have problem-solving tasks, very common in inquiry-based learning types of classrooms that we often see in international schools. If your school uses that type of curriculum. Things like ranking tasks, where students have to give their opinion about something and agree on an order in which it should be. Again, it promotes discussion. Any kind of information gap activity, such as a barrier game. And of course, things like debates and role plays, which are obviously very good opportunities for the spontaneous production of language. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list at all. Basically, any task or interaction that requires your learners to spontaneously generate language will create opportunities for emergent language. But I do think these types of tasks work particularly well in those sort of inquiry-based learning, project-based or discovery learning contexts. But even if you don't use or you're not a fan of those approaches, we can still integrate elements of these into our lessons. I think the idea is to avoid students just repeating, copying, or regurgitating prepackaged answers to things. That's not going to help their language develop. So if those were our ingredients, then we need our chef skills as well, our teaching techniques that we need to employ to allow our learners to produce more language, I guess. And so this might include things like just including a wider variety of task types in our lesson. Having regular opportunities for discussion and collaboration. Purposeful questioning, or I guess more considered or skillful use of teacher questioning. So, being aware of when we're using referential questioning, that's where, we don't know the answer and it's a kind of, there is no perhaps correct answer, versus display questions where the answer is already known by the teacher, and the range of answers could be more limited. A really important thing with our multilingual learners, but with all learners as well, is providing that wait time, that thinking time for them to process. And that's linked to techniques like think, pair, share, which again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but where students can think about something, share their idea with a partner, and then share it with a larger group or the class as a whole. And other visible learning techniques as well, I think are really useful here, because probably the main example that's really prevalent in the UK in classrooms at the moment is using mini whiteboards. So hopefully we can recognize that many of these techniques are compatible with a range of different teaching approaches. Okay, they're not a methodology in and of themselves at all. They can be used in any type of classroom. And I think the other key point of the metaphor is that just as people can use and make a meal kit, most teachers can, of course, we can just teach from the book, and we can, we get to the lesson and it's absolutely fine. But if we really want to create something with a bit more depth and variety and more impact in terms of the language and content knowledge of our students, then it requires certain skills and strategies. And these skills can be identified and taught and practiced. And so this is definitely a useful area of focus for professional development and training if you're somebody who's involved in doing that at your school. And if you're a teacher yourself, then you might be thinking as we go through this, well, are there any of these areas that I feel comfortable with, or any that I feel less comfortable with, and you may want to focus on strengthening those, or just continuing to work with your strengths as well. So our next question to consider then is how we decide what emergent language to focus on and when to let it go. But clearly we can't spend every lesson following up every opportunity for language development. Otherwise we'd never achieve our learning goals. We'd never get past the first stage of a lesson. And there is certainly no right or wrong answer here, but there are definitely some possible considerations when choosing what language to focus on. And so one of those would be language that causes miscommunication. An example might be if a child is writing or telling a story and they said something like, "The boy was very scary and ran away." And what they mean is the boy was very scared and ran away. And in many languages, they don't make the distinction between words, pairs of like scared and scary, or bored and boring. And obviously the meanings can be almost opposite or reversed. So this might be an example where you'd want to intervene in some way. The other thing to consider is the language necessary for the task, or what language is necessary for this task? And, how can I fill that gap? Often this kind of language is what we call functional language. So that's language for a specific purpose. It might be giving an opinion, asking questions, or responding to questions from others. If you want more information on that, go and see our Enhancing Classroom Talk webinar that we did last year. But also, if you understand the children's home language, it's often really useful to kind of notice what they're saying in their home language, and then provide them the English version, where it will be useful in the future. Something else we can look at are those repeated errors or issues that recur. And this might be gaps in language, you notice. It could just be that they're using a very limited range of language, or it could be inaccuracies or mistakes that you keep hearing and seeing. And again, especially if they're causing some kind of miscommunication, or they really reduce the effectiveness or clarity of the communication that's happening. And obviously, this is going to be particularly relevant or useful if you're working with a group who share a home language, or you've got large groups of learners that share a particular home language in your settings, because they are likely to have similar issues. And therefore, focusing on those issues will be useful for everyone, not just for individuals. And connected to this as well, we want to think about what language gets used, the most often, high frequency language. If you're working in secondary level, tertiary level, there are resources like Avril Coxhead's academic word list, which lists the most frequently used items of academic vocabulary, for example, which can guide you towards what kind of language students might need. And you may also be aware of the concept of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 language, where tier 1 is everyday language and tier 3 is subject-specific jargon, and tier 2 is language that's kind of used across the curriculum, but it's still more formal and academic. And it's often that tier 2 language that our multilingual learners really need to focus on. I think a really underappreciated factor is just choosing interesting or kind of useful language. May not be necessarily that relevant to what we're teaching, but it's just fun, or it's interesting some way. So a good example of this would be the kind of idioms that come up in English, but obviously all languages will have their equivalent uses. So, we always think of the sort of cliches in English, like raining cats and dogs, but, there's a lot more that actually get used in real life. And just to sort of focus on those and, maybe sharing the cultural or historical reasons behind those phrases, or finding out from other learners how they say that in their own language. And, you get these can often just promote these discussions and this broadening of language awareness and this appreciation of language. And lastly, you want to consider if the language has been previously taught, because if it's been taught before, then obviously it could be a good opportunity to remind them of that, and that they should know it, so that can help them consolidate previously learned vocabulary. But of course, this also means that you need to have a really strong sense of what your learners have previously learned. So this is where this collaboration between our EAL specialists at the school and our subject specialists or classroom teachers can really come in, so that we want to have that awareness of what language is being covered and what it's reasonable to expect our students to know. And I think a key part of this as well, of choosing what language to work with, is having embedded within that a system for recording the language. So having systematic ways of recording it is really important. And we can think of this both from the teacher and the learner's point of view. So for the teacher, it might look like actively monitoring during discussions and group work, just getting down on the student's level and listening. Having a system for recording examples for delayed feedback. Most people might just write something in a notebook. Maybe you've got a iPad or a smartphone, you prefer doing it with that. And another thing that I think is really important, if you want to work with emergent language systematically, is having a system for using the board or screen or interactive whiteboard or whatever you have in your classroom. So often having a permanent or semi-permanent new language section which gets filled up each lesson is an approach that a lot of EAL teachers or English language teachers use, but there's no reason that can't be extended to other contexts as well. And here's an example based on the example I talked about at the start of the lesson, talking about plants and plant growth of, this is something that could just be added to during a lesson in a fairly ad hoc way. And by the end of it, you have quite a potentially sort of language rich resource. And of course, for it to be meaningful for our learners, we also need to think about how they go about recording the language as well. So for our learners, then, I think probably the key thing here is to agree a vocabulary recording system or language recording system that is consistent across different lessons or topics. And I think that probably has to be in liaison with your sort of EAL or EAL team. So agreeing a system, and that could be something as simple as just the learners always having a few pages at the back of their notebook where they record their new language. But I think it's also going to be more powerful if you have a really clear expected format, how learners record the new language, and you basically kind of train them to use that. So, that would involve providing them with an expected model. So an example might be, some of my animations are a bit all over, but an example might be there's a pro forma, a template for recording new words or phrases with a picture section for a picture, what is it in my language, a translation, and an example sentence. And I would highlight the importance of the example sentence because that's giving you context. And it also helps you understand if the learners really understood the word or not as well. Of course, depending on their language proficiency, that may need to be scaffolded, and it's absolutely fine to kind of provide examples to begin with, and then as they get more independent in their language use, they can create their own. Using classroom displays can also be very useful for making regularly occurring language visible in your classroom. But again, only do it if you actually use it and you refer your learners to it. If it's just there to look nice, then, what is the point? And I think I would also recommend refreshing it semi-regularly to keep up with the progress and the development of your learners. And lastly, it can be useful to have some form of vocabulary repository, somewhere to store the new words. And this doesn't necessarily have to be somewhere visible like a display, but it could be like a vocabulary box. A system I've seen and I've used myself is to have some blank cards, and the learners can write down new language that they've learned at the course of the lesson. They put it in the box at the end of the lesson, and then you've got this kind of record of recently covered new language that can be reused or recycled in things like vocabulary games or review activities. And they can make good little lesson lead-ins or brain breaks, to just do some quick retrieval tasks with the students. And of course, these days, these repositories don't have to be physical. They could also be electronic. So you could use a shared document or an app like Quizlet as well, especially for your sort of more independent secondary learners. And as well as choosing what to focus on, we need to think about when to do it as well. And you'll notice I'm referring a lot to this book by Chin and Norrington Davies, Working with Emergent Language. So they offer this list of questions to ask yourself before deciding on an intervention. So I'm just going to display here. I'll let you read those. And again, for some of us, this way of thinking might be second nature. But for other teachers, it might just be that this just helps you sort of jog your memory and gets you used to thinking in a more kind of language-oriented way if you're not an EAL specialist by training. Okay, so we're going to have a look then at some of the more practical techniques now, and the types of techniques that we can use when we are dealing with emergent language. And in their research, in the book I just mentioned by Chin and Norrington Davies, they observed a whole host of different techniques that were used when teachers were working with emergent language. Now, their research was with English as a foreign language teachers specifically, in I think secondary and tertiary contexts. So they're working in a very specific context, but all the techniques we're going to talk about can absolutely be brought into any subject classroom or any classroom in an international school as well. And many of these techniques will be things that you already do without thinking about it as a teacher. But I do think it's useful to identify and label them and consider their impact on our learners' language development so that we can be a bit more intentional about how we deal with emergent language. So the first technique they mention is explicit reformulation. So this is simply where the student says something and we think, well, actually, there's a better way to say that, or you need to say it in a different way. And you would just introduce the other way of saying it to the learner. I think this kind of intervention is particularly common, I suppose, if you are a first language speaker of English, because you have that intuition of, okay, that sounds right or that doesn't sound right, even if you perhaps aren't aware of the grammatical reason behind it or the linguistic reason behind it. But I do think in international schools, in a multilingual context where we're trying to be inclusive, we do need to be quite wary of that native speaker intuition. Because it can, in my own experience, certainly I found that I've sort of ended up sort of saying things like, oh, that isn't natural, or English speakers wouldn't say that. And then I think you have to take a step back and think, well, actually, what I mean is that's not how I would say it. And I think we have to remember that, English and languages in general, they're not, they are open source. They are not the preserve of a particular nationality or social group or individual. So when we are thinking about what to correct or change or suggest alternatives for, does it matter if the learner has said something that just sounds a bit strange to our ears if the meaning that they're intending is clear? And I would say probably not in most situations. However, of course, if there is a problem that it's not clear, then it might be really useful to correct that. Recasting is the implicit correction of language. So this might be where our student says a sentence with a mistake in it or an inaccuracy, and the teacher repeats it with the correct form. And this is very commonly used, of course, at the early years and our younger students. And you may also want to use it with students who are more reluctant, or you feel it wouldn't like to be corrected, whether it's to save face or because I don't know, they're teenagers and they just at that stage where they get a bit self-conscious. And as I said, this is actually in the research that Chin and Norrington Davies did. This was by far the most common intervention they found teachers doing. But they also noticed that it was the intervention that didn't appear to result in any change of behavior from the learners. So they never really saw it resulting in the learner correcting themselves. And probably that's because it's often happening in the flow of a conversation. But also, it's worth understanding that if we're using recasting, how do we know whether or not the learner's actually noticed and understood our correction? So there might be adaptations we can do to this, like prompting the learner to produce back to us the form we want, or other strategies that we'll talk about. Another one that they noticed was this clarification. So this is when you want to indicate that you don't understand. You might say, well, what do you mean? I didn't, I don't know what you're trying to say. And confirmation is when you paraphrase what the learner wants to say, what you think they want to say. So are you saying that? So you mean? And I think, these are really useful skills both for teachers, but also to teach our learners to use, especially once we start expecting them to work independently in small groups. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that for some teachers, it can feel a bit rude to say to someone, I don't understand, I can't understand what you're saying. But I do think it's important that as long as you do it respectfully and you're showing a genuine curiosity and interest in understanding what the learner wants to say, then actually I think it can be a really positive thing to model, because you're helping to create a classroom culture where students will feel comfortable saying, oh, I don't understand. Can you clarify, or can you say that again? And I think so. I think it is actually quite a useful technique to use. And this one, if you are, if you've done any form of language teaching, it's kind of your bread and butter. But elicitation, so this is where you encourage learners to reformulate or produce the output themselves without you providing it as input. So this might look like, asking a question, what word could we use here? It can often just look like pausing. So we could say that the amount of pressure is, and then you let the learner fill in the gap. And this is also obviously quite useful if you know your the language of your learners as well, because you might want to refer to something they've said in their language. Alejandro said that he had a dolor de cabeza. What word would we use for that? Ah, yes, that's right, headache. And something as simple as just repeating what the student said can be used as elicitation as well, if it's combined with the intonation or facial expression. Okay. And again, if you are someone who knows about grammar and the grammar of English and language, then of course you can use metalinguistic feedback. So you might direct the student towards a particular word type or a particular grammar structure. Obviously, this requires the knowledge and meta language from both the teacher and the students. So if you're working in a context where the students get taught about grammar and they know the words around that and you are comfortable using it yourself, then you can use it. And if you're not, you don't have to at all. There's other techniques that you can use. There's about 4 more of these techniques to go. Okay, so I'm going to, extension is, I think, for me, probably my favorite technique, and certainly the one that I find myself using the most when I'm in the classroom. And it's because it doesn't necessarily follow from an error or a communicative breakdown. It's just there to enhance and build on what the students can already do. So in its simplest form, an extension might just be offering an alternative word or phrase, like the examples there. But there are also broadly 2 types of extension that we can identify when we're developing language. So one is what we call horizontal extension, which is taking a sentence and examining the patterns that are possible from left to right. And so this is really good for highlighting word order or grammatical structures and understanding what types of word fit in a particular place in a sentence. So here's an example from a geography topic. Tourism is important for upland areas because it provides jobs. And of course, we can do a lot of work around this kind of extension if we want to. So we might want to highlight, for example, which verb forms are acceptable after the pronoun it in this sentence, in order to expand the range of communication the students can produce. If your students are comfortable with it, you might want to label it with the meta language, or base verb and things like that. And you might want to highlight things like the subject verb agreement and how it's different for singular nouns, so tourism, singular, so we need to use the verb is and the pronoun it, and we use to use the form provides for it to agree. Whereas if we're using a plural form like tourists, we use different forms. And you may even want to highlight forms that aren't possible, again, especially if you notice your students are using that. Strategies like using sentence starters and substitution tables are really excellent tools for promoting horizontal extension, and they can quite easily be drawn up ad hoc on the board, especially once you start getting kind of used to them. By contrast, then, vertical extension is when we're expanding the lexical range within a sentence by slotting in new options into appropriate spaces. So again, often we do this in the form of a substitution table. So let's again, in this sentence, we want to expand the range of options that could be used in this slot for the word. So what could we replace the word good with in this slot? So again, you could scaffold that. You could have positive words, negative words. Notice that some of the words are adjectives, but not all of them. We also have a noun in there as well. And of course, this can be extended as well across the sentence. So there are often multiple slots that you can extend vertically. However, I do recommend usually focusing only on one slot at a time, especially when you're working with your newer to English or younger learners, because there's only so much that they can take in at once, and especially if they're kind of new to the idea, you want to keep it simple to begin with. And another example of that would be here from a primary lesson. So this is from the students talking about a class survey that they've done about food, healthy food that they like or don't like. So if they imagine they're describing a bar chart, and we want to give them the vocabulary to do that. So our results show that, give them a list, and we can also support things like that quite nicely with visuals as well. And again, obviously this is a pre-prepared example that I've produced, but it's quite easy. You could write this up on the board in no time if you wanted to, easily enough. Okay. And the great thing about substitution tables is that they tend to combine anyway both types of extension. So I think this is why these are such powerful scaffolding tools for our EAL learners. And for more on creating substitution tables, we do have a webinar on that topic from a couple of years ago, if you want to go and find that. But yeah, I love a substitution table. So beyond extension, then we can also talk about sharing examples of useful or interesting language that the learners have produced. And again, I like this because it doesn't necessarily follow on from an error or some kind of communication breakdown. It's just building on what the students are doing, and it works really nicely. And when you have a mixed ability group or you have mixed proficiency groups, where you can highlight good uses of language, and again, it often works well as delayed feedback after a task, and you can pick out some great examples of language. I think we've mentioned this already a little bit, but you can always prompt recall from your student by okay, if you know that they've learned that word before, you just want to prompt that. And again, that's why it's important to have a really clear idea of the kind of language your learners have been learning and what they're familiar with, and understanding your learners' language proficiency. And learner-initiated interventions were, again, something that they noticed would come up a lot. And this is simply any intervention that was triggered by the learner rather than the teacher. So this is where the learners were saying, oh, what's the word for, or what does this mean? How do you say this? And so on. And obviously, these are really useful. This is actually a really useful skill to teach your learners to do, right? And to teach them the English phrases for doing as well. Obviously, they may well start doing it in their home language to begin with, and then as they get more comfortable into English, it's really useful to be able to encourage and also not normalize the use of this kind of language in the classroom so that students don't feel stigmatized that they have to ask. It just make it part of what happens in your classroom. Like we're a multilingual classroom. We're always going to have these kind of situations occurring, and not make it feel like it's anything stigmatizing. Okay, so lastly, I just want to take you through a few examples of what this might actually look like in different contexts. Just to apply it. And none of these are meant to be, groundbreaking examples of amazing practice. This is simply trying to represent how this might look in an everyday classroom situation. So our first case study is in a secondary context. So I want to imagine it's an English literature lesson. The class are working on Shakespeare, and in this case, it's Macbeth. And they're doing some work on characterization and character change and describing characters and emotions and things like that. And the teacher asks the class, how did Macduff feel when Macbeth kills his family? And asks the learners to write one word on their mini whiteboard. So all the students hold up their vocabulary, and the teacher is, horrified to see that like 3/4 of the students have just written sad or something like that, some kind of quite basic kind of bit of vocabulary. And the teacher wants some more expressive language. So they might ask if the students know any stronger words. Okay, so here we're using some elicitation and some extension. So we might ask the learners to confer, to talk to each other, and to write a better word on their whiteboard. Okay, and then this results in a better list. Okay, so students actually think about it for a little bit. They come up with some more words. The teacher writes them on the board, and they might make a note like the word gutted, which is the sort of thing that a student might produce in the UK, because if you're not from the UK, you might not be familiar with this term, but it means if you're very disappointed or upset, you're gutted, and you might want to point out that that's really only appropriate for spoken English using with your friends. But the teacher also noticed that some of the students produce words that have slightly different meanings. For example, one of the students writes, he is grief. So the teacher might explain using some explicit formulation that, well, we can't use the word grief like that, because, but you might say he is grief stricken. And again, there could be a bit of metalinguistic feedback. This is secondary level, it's an English class. You'd expect the learners to have this knowledge. So you might ask, is grief an adjective or a noun? Or how about grief stricken? Like how do they, and that's helping the learners understand how those words will get used in a sentence. So you can see that so relatively quickly, the teachers worked with the learners there to extend their language, develop a bit more nuance around some of the vocabulary. And it's vocabulary that is immediately applicable to the topic and the context that they're discussing. And therefore, it's much more likely to be used and retained because it's being used, in the moment. Okay, so if we look at our primary classroom, and as is often the case in primary, the children are doing some story writing. Okay, they're doing some creative writing around fairy stories and fairy tales, and they're sharing their fairy stories. And the teacher notices that one child is only really using the phrase "and then" as a linking phrase in their story. So and then, and then, and then, and then. And this is something that certainly English-speaking children do, as well as our multilingual users of English as well. And of course, the teacher knows that this child in particular has covered different sequencing words and linking words with their EAL teacher in a previous lesson. So she asks the child if she can remember any of those other words to talk about when things happen in the story. And then she's able to elicit a few more of those, and she gets this child to to rewrite her story using some of those words. And then she thinks, well, this is probably useful to work with the whole class as well. So maybe later in the lesson, at the end of the lesson, she makes sure to share some examples with the whole class where children have successfully used different sequencing words in their story. And maybe she writes them up again on the board to refresh those memories and to have a record. And again, you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, this is just kind of standard teaching, good practice, and you're absolutely right. Yeah, there's nothing, this is nothing incredibly revolutionary that I'm talking about here. This is just trying to make you aware that actually probably a lot of the things that teachers do without really thinking about it are actually really good. It's you're working with emergent language, and even if you're not aware of it. And my final example comes from the early years, because although we often don't think about teaching languages explicitly in that age group, it's you can still absolutely work with emergent language. So imagine a group of children are doing their busy learning or playtime or however you want to describe it, and they're around a sandpit, and a child finds a beetle and asks the teacher, "Well, what's this? Is it a bug?" So we've got some learner-initiated intervention here, and the teacher says, "Yes, it's a type of bug. It's called a beetle," and asks the child to repeat it. Can you say it back to me, beetle? And the other children are curious, so she asks them if they can find any more bugs or if they know of any more bugs. And so immediately the children shoot off to find some real examples. Maybe I don't know how many sometimes there's creepy crawlies just crawling around, but if it's anything like my daughter's nursery, they often have these plastic models, don't they, of like different animals and including insects. So children often really they're really aware of all the different toys and things that are in their environment, so they'll go off and they'll find them and they'll bring them over. And as they bring these examples back, the teacher can then label them and repeat the language. So this is very much extension. So as the children are finding these different examples, the teacher could also bring out the picture dictionary or the nature book that they've got, and they can look at the mini beast section, and then the teacher can point at the different insects or mini beasts, and the children can ask questions, or and the teacher can add and build on that vocabulary by identifying the different bugs, for example. And of course, this is no different at all to what is standard early years practice. And that's absolutely true. So, a really large part of early years pedagogy is dealing with emergent language, because that's how humans learn language in context, right? So actually, and in some ways, we kind of forget about these emergent language techniques that we just do without thinking about with our early years children or our younger children. And as we get older, we sort of forget how powerful these things can be, I think. But obviously, you adapt them as the children get older and they become more sophisticated and more focused on academic language. But really, they're kind of just variations on the same techniques that we do without thinking with our own children as well at home when they're learning to speak, by extending, by building on the language that they already know. So that's really everything from me today. Just to return at the end to my slightly tortured kitchen classroom metaphor that I used at the beginning, but I hope I've inspired you to learn how to cook up some delicious and nutritious language enriching learning experiences for your learners. And also I want to provide the reference that for the text that I used for a lot of the content in this session. There it is. And then over to you, Shaka.
Well, thank you so
If
much,
there's any
Tom,
questions.
for the webinar. Yeah, I loved the food-related metaphors, although, yeah, as you did say, I think you've made us all hungry. There weren't any questions during the webinar, but if anyone's got any questions now, please do put them in the chat. We'll have a look if anything comes up. And as you may be thinking about the questions, just to reiterate that we will share the recording of the webinar, as well as any references and the link to the webinar on substitution tables that Tom mentioned earlier. We'll put it in the post-webinar email that you should receive within the next day or two. So yeah, feel free, and obviously feel free to share the webinar recording with anyone you think might find it useful. Okay, still no questions in the chat, so maybe let's wrap up. I think there's one now. Oh, how would you get started with a zero English speaker at grade 3? I think that's yeah, that is quite a broad question,
but I think it comes down to obviously when they have a learner who doesn't know any or very limited language, then you're not so much going to be correcting things that they say, because all you want really is to get them to start producing. So you're probably going to want to use those extending techniques a little bit, but again, you have to really be careful not to overload them. So it's yeah, it's really giving them it's building on what they know, but obviously they're starting from a very small base. And it is tricky because when they're obviously in a classroom full of other learners who probably have a lot more language than they do, that can be quite overwhelming. But by pairing them, by pairing them with learners with a similar proficiency, or who also are sort of lower but maybe a little bit higher than them, that's one very important technique, isn't it? Buddying them with someone who is slightly higher, but whilst also giving them opportunities sometimes to work with learners who are much more proficient as well, because they will be able to provide the models as well. But yeah, it wouldn't be, there's no one technique, is there? It's working with, it's meeting the learner where they are. And if you can have that one-to-one time as well with those learners, where you can give them those, you can give them the specific scaffolding that they need to build on what they've got. That's really useful as well.
yes. And yeah, there's one more question. And there are learners who can read fluently but have very limited comprehension. How do you help them? And that might be beyond the scope of this webinar.
A little bit, isn't it? It's reading, but yes, there are techniques. Yeah, well, yeah, you're focusing more on meaning and working with meaning rather than working with decoding. So it's going to be around using things like story sequencing is always a good one, isn't it? Giving the student storyboards or pictures that tell the story, and allowing them to and then having them to fit it together, so that they need to understand what's happening in the story in order to be able to sequence it properly. But yeah, it's yeah, I think we have some really good resources on our website around reading for meaning. So I would direct you towards those.
Lovely. Well, thank you, Tom. And our time is up. So can I just ask you, can you move your slide to the next one? I just wanted to make everyone aware of our upcoming events. We have got another webinar advertised for the 2nd of April, where we'll be looking at EAL and SEND, and how to take an effective whole school approach to supporting students who might be both EAL and SEND. And also just to make you aware that bookings are open for our upcoming courses. In March, we've got these 3 courses coming up. Embedding language for learning is all about teaching academic language to EAL learners. And then we have a course specifically for teaching assistants and a course for EAL coordinators as well. And there will be a couple more courses coming up in May before the summer. Assessing the language proficiency of learners who use EAL, and also looking at adaptive teaching strategies. So if you're interested in any of those, or you may have colleagues who might benefit from some of them, please have a look on our website and you can sign up through there. So thank you very much for attending today's webinar, and hopefully see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Goodbye.